So another great insight on another region. We're going to step back to sort of where we began at a broader look, and our next speaker, Hibba Abugideiri, is going to speak with you about the role of women across the region in sort of case study basis, and see what general conclusions can be drawn there to make our mosaic of understanding today. Hibba Abugideiri is Associate Professor of History and former Director of the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies at Villanova University. Before coming to Villanova, she was Assistant Professor of History, Honors, and International Affairs at the George Washington University. She received her doctorate in history from Georgetown, where she completed her master's degree in Arab Studies. As a gender historian, her research interests are varied. Her book, Gender and the Making of Modern Medicine in Colonial Egypt, examines the impact of colonial medicine on Egyptian gender relations. She's also published extensively on issues of women in Islam, including an article in Religion and Literature, Faith and Feminism, Daughters of Abraham and the Muslim World. She's the senior editor of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islam and Women. Welcome, Hibba Abugideiri.
Okay, so I'd like to take a minute to thank Susan Douglas and Bassam Haddad for inviting me. This has been a really, for me, very stimulating day. So what I thought I'd do, I don't like to be hooked up to mics and, stand at podiums and give talks. I'm one to freely walk, but I know that I won't stay within my time limit, so I am going to restrict myself to my notes. So what I thought I would offer today is less sort of detailed historical content than to offer a theoretical framework. And the framework that I'm proposing today is one of citizenship. And I'd like to look at three facets of citizenship to sort of frame this discussion of why women matter to the uprising. And those three facets are gender ideology, legal rights, and the female body. So as a historian, it would behoove me not to, in the course of making my remarks, also point out problematic continuities despite the uprising, but also maybe point out to hopeful discontinuities created by the uprising. And so this question of continuities and discontinuities is an important one, but I also have to say I entered this topic with a little bit of trepidation because as a historian, I don't think, obviously with things continuing to unfold, I have less to say probably about the present, as did, for example, Rosie, than I feel I have firmer footing in the past. And so you'll see that sort of crop up in the course of, in terms of my own framing of this topic. Okay, so in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, the question of citizenship has taken center stage. Of course, citizenship really implies that all citizens of a state are endowed with equal rights and opportunities, but this has not been the case in the Middle East. I borrow Suad Joseph's working definition of citizenship as it applies to the Middle East, which is, quote, the legal processes and socioeconomic, cultural, and political practices that define citizen subjects and construct their rights and obligations. So what a citizen is, i.e. ideology, and what rights he or she has, i.e. legal rights, are politically motivated, which means that the state defines citizenship primarily through its own interests, not those of its citizen. And so this question of state hegemony and its constant pursuit is a factor that I think we need to keep in the back of our minds because it is critical in these conceptions of citizenship that I'll be talking about. The uprisings can be viewed as the masses' objection to the state's self-interested ideas and practices of citizenship. Because women are critical to the homogenizing processes of state building, not only because of their reproductive bodies, but also because they are perceived to be a malleable group that can be indoctrinated and molded into ideal citizens of the state, this has meant that in the Middle East, the language of citizenship is very much gendered, and gender ideologies very much frame its practice. This has been true for both secular and Islamist states. This is kind of paradoxical, right? We think of these as very diametrically opposed ideologies, and in many ways, obviously, they are. On the question of gender, I'm positing that they're not as different as we think. So if you compare constructions of womanhood of, say, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who is, right, the quintessential secular nationalist, who is anti-Islam, with Ayatollah Khomeini, the quintessential ultra-conservative Islamist who is staunchly anti-West, you'd find that their constructions are in fact very similar. They're not that different. Despite the trappings of modern and traditional discourses, both ultimately rely on woman as symbols of their new nation, which we clearly see in Ataturk's construction of the new woman versus Khomeini's construction of the new Muslim woman. And these are tropes that were deployed within their discourses. And both understood women's primary role as mothers in the sense of Republican motherhood, right? And it is in these two distinct discursive functions of woman as national symbols and reproducers of the nation that foreground secular and Islamist ideologies. And this is because both these ideologies see women as repositories of cultural authenticity and therefore rely on gender ideology to legitimate the state. So the first part of my argument about citizenship is exposing the patriarchal political imaginaries of these two dominant political hegemons in the region that have historically relied on the same gender ideology or the same gender regime in very self-interested ways. In the aftermath of the uprising, especially where long-standing despots were overturned, Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, and Libya, for example, there was hope for new political imaginaries. During the transition, however, we've heard very familiar constructions of gendered citizenship propagated. So, for example, Egypt, where I feel a stronger footing in than the other areas, in the struggle for political hegemony after Mubarak's toppling, the Muslim Brotherhood has touted typical Islamist constructions of gendered citizenship as a way of making their case for their particular brand of government in the market of competing ideologies and factions. Shireen Hafiz calls these gender contestations among competing factions in Egypt in 2013 gender Olympics. And at the time she was writing this, there was sort of this anticipation about who was going to win, which contender over gender would win. And of course, this is sort of a historical continuity that I'm emphasizing. Sort of historical continuity number one. When it comes to citizenship rights, the state has constructed women's legal rights around their envisioned ideological functions as symbols and reproducers. Citizenship rights and gender ideology then become mutually reinforcing. Expectedly, the state has restricted women's full equality by denying them liberties afforded to men in order to regulate their bodies and labor in, again, the interest of the state. We see this clearly in the legal provisions related to the family, and I'll just give a very simple one here. In Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Libya, for instance, men who marry non-nationals still enjoy the full protection of the law, and their children are granted citizenship rights. Whereas children of women married to foreign nationals are not citizens and are not entitled to socioeconomic or political rights and privileges. Importantly, access to citizenship is not merely about the legal disparity between men and women, but an important factor also is class. So importantly, it needs to be noted that that legal reforms that have been passed have really not affected working class women because of the ways in which women's rights have been advocated largely by middle and upper class women. So citizenship practices are not only gendered, but are also hierarchical. Generally speaking, women's place in Arab society is considered to be the private space of the home. Government policies and laws that are often reinforced by Arab cultural traditions, including tribal honor systems, are what authorize women's access to the public. The best example here is Saudi Arabia's guardianship laws that regulate women's movement. Women must have written permission from a male relative, whether father, brother, or husband, to travel, attend university, get married, appear in court, so on and so forth. These legal restrictions on women bear out in the numbers. The economic participation of Arab women, lowest in the world. Literacy rates in the region, lowest in the world. Gender parity in education in the Arab world, lowest in the world. Jordan may be the only exception in this case. Women are underrepresented in politics, and here I'm speaking mostly represented in parliament and legislatures, lowest in the world. Also, in almost every Arab state, there's an absence of specific laws protecting women from violence. including intimate violence, and there's a lack of prosecution and punishment against perpetrators. Given the gendered and hierarchical nature of citizenship, it's not surprising that those who would have been excluded from enjoying those rights, women, but especially peasant, poor, and working class women, were able during the uprisings to participate politically through protest. So the act of protesting itself really shouldn't be overstated here. We didn't simply witness a movement for democracy in the uprisings, but more notably, or I should put democracy in quotes there, but more notably the democratization of political participation. The uprisings gave women the opportunity to visibly participate, but also to participate equally and to participate in the public sphere. The treatment of women by men as equals as they protested side by side with men, and these were often led by women or fomented by women activists, was seen at Tahrir in Egypt, and this was led by, quote, the leader of the revolution, Esma Mahfouz. Change Square in Yemen, Tawakkul Karman played a huge role, as did Munira Fakhru in the Pearl Square in Bahrain. The magnitude of this moment, watching these breathtaking and palpable demonstrations of national and gender solidarity take place in these squares, right, these sites of national freedom, was not lost on many of us. And women were critical. They participated in Tunisia, Morocco, Yemen, Libya, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Egypt with the singular purpose of, quote, taking down the regime. And just as they had done in anti-colonial nationalist movements against European imperialists in the early part of the 20th century, women again put the liberation of the nation before their own, now against native despots nearly a century later. In Libya, the initial protesters in Benghazi were mothers and families of 1,200 men massacred in a Tripoli prison in 1996. And their lawyers were imprisoned by Gaddafi in 2001, which led to these initial protests. Syrian women were at the forefront of demonstrations to free detained prisoners. Women in Kuwait joined protests that stormed and occupied the Kuwaiti National Assembly. And even in a few cases, in addition to taking down the regime, women saw the uprising as an opportunity to also contest the gendered inequalities of citizenship laws. So in Jordan, we see mothers, for instance, contesting citizenship laws who were part of the 1,300 demonstrators who protested government corruption, unemployment, the arrest of political activists, and the lack of political freedoms. Saudi women organized, as we all probably have heard, the big hoopla about Saudi women organizing a driving campaign to protest the ban on female driving, as well as vocalized protests against child marriage and no minimum marriage age. In Egypt, we forget that before 2011, there were a number of small-scale organized community protests by neighborhoods, associations, and most notably by labor movements. I bring this up to show that the 2011 mass protests did not emerge out of a vacuum, but also to point out that the labor movements were led by a significant contingent of highly active and organized women industrial workers. Some would argue that the labor movement's mass strike, again led by these women, was the final blow that forced Mubarak out. So women's participation mattered. It matters now as it's mattered in the past, but it's not new. Middle Eastern women more broadly, especially Egyptian, Iranian, and Turkish, have been long involved in politics. Since the turn of the 20th century, these women, to reiterate, have advocated for national independence first, and after independence, then for their own rights. So looking at Egypt, for example, Egyptian women participated in the 1919 revolution, which was the largest mass insurrection of the early 20th century in the Arab world in revolt of British imperialism. But it was aimed at liberating Egypt first. After the 1952 revolution that saw the free officers overthrow the Egyptian monarchy and oust the British and establish Egypt as a republic, women were actively involved in politics by either advocating for or contesting Nasser's socialist policies in the interest of their own rights. And that is an important point that I'll return to in a moment. And this is something that is not exceptional to the Middle East, but happens everywhere. This notion of what scholars often call third world feminism, which is in order for women to sort of realize their rights, they must first liberate their own country before they can liberate themselves. And so this question of prioritizing the nation or the state above women's rights is, again, nothing new, nothing exceptional about the Middle East, but it is certainly a continuity that proves problematic. Middle Eastern women also became involved in the Islamist movements, especially in the 1970s and 80s, and this is very well documented in many of the sources, in many of the in much of scholarship that talks about the reveiling movement of this period when many Muslim women were returning back to Islamic dress. What their participation reveals more broadly is that women were not passive recipients of state gender ideology and rights. They have envisioned their own ideals of citizenship. Sometimes they have fallen in line with the political imaginaries of the state, but oftentimes in opposition to it. But it is when their demands, their political demands, threatens the state's gender ideology and citizenship practices that women end up paying for those protests, most often with their bodies. And this is the sort of, again, in terms of talking broadly, this is the sort of second major historical continuity I'm drawing your attention to. While the state has cracked down and repressed all agitators through the use of violence and torture, women have been especially vulnerable. Female activists have been subjected to different forms of violence, and I think here Egypt offers the most stunning example, certainly the most documented. Sexual harassment has always been rampant in Egypt, though no single case of harassment was reported in Tahrir during the January 25th revolution. However, between the 2011 and 2014 period, that is the toppling of Hosni Mubarak to the establishment of General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who is of course the current president, endemic levels of harassment and sexual assault have been reported. Now, these assaults have been perpetrated by other men protesters, family members, but most notably the state itself. Excuse me. Women journalists and activists have been especially vulnerable as police have threatened them with gang rape and subjected them to virginity tests in an effort to deter their political participation. Strikingly, the state has used the threat of sexual violence as a pretext for further crackdowns on demonstrators, even as the new 2014 laws that criminalize harassment and sexual assault have proved inadequate for what they don't criminalize, which is the state's use of sexual torture. One particular story stands out, and it's quite gripping. In March of 2011, 19 female protesters were detained and subjected to torture and virginity tests. They were also assaulted in public and then arrested as prostitutes. Their names were registered as sex criminals as a result of their arrests in court records as well as press accounts as an attack on their respectability. And then once jailed, because of these laws, they were raped and sexually tortured as prisoners. Tunisian women have also been victims of sexual harassment and assault at the hands of security forces, as were hundreds of Libyan women who were raped, some even kidnapped or disappeared by Gaddafi's forces to bring dishonor to women's families. The heart-wrenching case of Iman al-Ubaidi is noteworthy here, not only because of the horrific gang rape she endured at the hands of Gaddafi's loyalists, but also because she went public with her assault, which was something very unprecedented. Sexual assault, sex in general is a taboo issue in the region, and therefore to publicize your own sexual assault was again unprecedented, and this caught the attention of the international media. To justify their sexual violence, the state, and here I'm talking about SCAF, which is the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, that's the power that took over after Mubarak, this is the interim government, as well as Islamists, deployed ideals of womanhood based on purity, virtuosity, and piety as a means of inculcating conformity, but also to objectify deviance. So those women revolutionaries who did not cease in their protests were deemed outliers, immoral, and deviants, and thus subject to state violence against them was rationalized. The regimes, in short, have tried to shame women back to their homes through systematic forms of sexual violence against their bodies in the effort to subdue women's political participation. Finally, True to history, women's political participation in the uprisings has not produced the gains or realized the democratic ideals of citizenship that women envisioned or even the uprisings envisioned. And we can see this during the transition in areas that deal with political decision-making. So just a few pieces of evidence here. The number of women in parliament and cabinets, even though in some countries looks like it looks like a positive gain, overall during the transitional government has been significantly smaller than in the pre-revolutionary governments. Tunisia's draft constitution, for example, is openly ambiguous about safeguarding women's equality in public and private spheres, and this despite Tunisia being often thought of as the model, but also about guaranteeing non-discrimination against women in the economic, social, and legal spheres. The 2012 Egyptian constitution, drafted exclusively by men, did not prevent discrimination against women or safeguard limited rights. The women that they didn't safeguard the limited rights that women had gained through personal status laws, and these included marriage age, divorce, inheritance, and the right to pass citizenship to their children. The Libyan and Yemeni transition also did not include any women. So in this question of citizenship, right, inclusivity in the political decision-making process, again, despite women's sacrifices, despite their participation, ultimately fail women by not allowing them entry into those spheres. There have been some notable gains for particularly, or most notably, Saudi Arabia. The kingdom introduced a 20% quota for women in the consultative body. Some would argue, well, the consultative body really has very limited power, but even so, some argue that it's a huge step forward in terms of women's political participation, and more notably for their inclusion. In 2011, the Saudi king granted women suffrage, right? We forget that Saudi Arabia and the Vatican are the last two countries to grant women the female vote. And so Saudi women were thus granted that in 2011. And the Saudi Labor Ministry redoubled its efforts to get Saudi women, who make up 60% of university graduates, to join the workforce. And to do so, there have been a number of initiatives that they've done with education. There are more opportunities for women in the higher education sector. Women are now able to study law, engineering, pharmacy, and architecture at some, not all, at some universities. And there are some opportunities for women to study abroad. Other initiatives include clerks of stores were to be replaced by women, and this was a law that was apparently completed by 2012. It was a process that unfolded, completed by 2012, and of course what this did was it opened a number of jobs for women to in replacing these male clerks in these stores or a market. Finally, the Saudi government has ordered the morality police to not harass women, not to veil their faces. So these are considered to be sort of some gains. Still, there's a general perception that women have lost many of their earlier won rights that they gained before the pre-revolution. And the emboldened position of Islamists and more conservative Salafis in the political landscape is particularly looming for women in general, but most notably secularist women in places like Egypt and Tunisia, but really in others as well. So the failing after a revolution is also not new, and this is the sort of the last historical continuity I'd like to sort of raise as a point. Historically, women's participation in political movements or revolution, and this is not only in the Middle East but globally, have typically been welcomed and needed at a particular point, but once that power is established, women are quickly marginalized from the political process. We saw this during the anti-colonial nationalist movements. We saw this during the independence era when nationalist governments relied on women's movements to legitimate their secular policies, only to ignore them once those policies were established. We saw this during the rise of Islamism, especially in Iran and Sudan, when Islamists relied on women to support the Islamic cause to establish their new states, only to relegate them to the home, at least in terms of ideology and policies, afterwards. We see it again now in the transition after the Arab uprising. So I've pointed to a number of sort of problematic continuities that the Arab uprising has brought to the surface. Just to kind of reiterate, the gendered constructions of citizenship in terms of gender ideology and rights that have been similarly deployed by opposing factions in the aftermath of the uprisings. Women's longstanding political participation in movements of change and revolution that once threatened the state's ideals of citizenship, women end up paying some sort of price in terms of their bodies. And then last, the failure of movements, revolutions, states to truly include women in the political process after their sacrifices. So what is hopeful about the uprising? And I think I'm coming full circle to stuff that Bassam had said earlier, you know, sort of where are the promising discontinuities? And I think the largest that is echoed in most of the scholarship that I've read is the refusal to be silenced, right? This seems to be an irrevocable thing at this point. Neither the people in general nor women in particular can go back to the old status quo, not after knowing that their collective will and voices have the power to successfully topple despots. Part of this refusal to be silenced has been facilitated by the use of social media, and I just want to say a few words about that. Social media, of course, was a way of bypassing the media controls by the state. Social media, of course, was critical to facilitating the uprisings in terms of tactical and coordinated strategies for protesting, broadcasting information, but also holding the state accountable with incontrovertible proof of state murder, torture, and abuses. But social media has been especially critical for women to connect to regional and global networks within civil societies elsewhere. This has not only allowed them to organize more effectively, but also to tap into global support for gender equality. The uprising then broke the wall of fear and intimidation, which are pillars of social control by police states. A second possible discontinuity is whether women choose to how women choose to prioritize their rights. In the past, as I've said, their strategy of prioritizing the nation first has notably failed in securing the rights that they are calling for. The question becomes how citizenship can be imagined through a non-hierarchical, non-classist gender regime. And as long as the will to protest persists, then there's hope for greater inclusivity and therefore democratization that will break the historical cycle of oppressive gendered citizenship making. So I'll stop there and take whatever questions that you might have.